There are plenty of things that you should do to keep your website running smoothly when it comes to regular tasks, right? We have quarterly things to do, monthly, sometimes even weekly. And you could be doing all of those things to help your website be an incredible asset for you. But what about yearly? If you're already keeping an eye on your site and you're already doing all the things you should be doing, is there anything that happens yearly that you could do? Or is it another one of those new year, new you remixes that get thrown around every year? Well, actually, there are a few things that an annual milestone could be useful for. First is probably the most obvious is the copyright date at the bottom of your website. There's a few things out there that I've read suggesting that you don't actually need a copyright date at all. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to pretend to tell you what the right way is. But if you have chosen to use a copyright date, an outdated one definitely doesn't give full confidence in how up to date the overall website is. The caveat to this is the current year can be set dynamically, which means you don't have to go in and manually update it every year. And that's going to depend on your platform, your theme, how you've set up the website. But technically, a date can be displayed dynamically. So if you have either the launch date to current date or just sort of the current year, it can be set dynamically so you don't have to go in and do it every year. So if you are adding the current year, I would definitely recommend going that route. That is really interesting from a psychological perspective. Obviously, as a consumer, the copyright year then means that it's not always a great indicator. If the site's actually been updated, it might actually be better to not have a dynamic date from a consumer perspective, because then you know the last time somebody touched the site. But that could also mean that somebody just forgot to update the copyright date and has updated the site. So it's really just a trust and confidence factor rather than an actual indicator of how good or up to date the site is. But psychologically, it's good to have that current year in that footer if you've decided to go that route. Now's the time to talk with someone who can provide proper guidance on whether you actually need the year. What better time to do it than when you have to go in and update it? And then, like I said, if you choose to go with the year, make sure it's accurate. A current year is anywhere from neutral to positive, while a past year is anywhere from a neutral to a negative. So if you're going to go with a year, have it be updated and make sure that if you can, make it dynamic. Another great thing that you can do when it comes to the yearly milestone is reviewing your goals and your strategy. Things evolve over the course of a year, and the new year seems to be one of the more widely recognized fresh start dates, which means it's a great time to evaluate your website. We all know how hard it is to see our resolutions through and turn them into long-term changes or habits. It's the strategy that makes the difference and the tools that you've given yourself to follow all of that through. It's best to connect with the reason behind your goals or your resolutions, and that's going to give you the most likely success when you're setting those things. And so it's important to check in with your website too. You're going to check in every now and then to see if your website is still reinforcing the other efforts you're putting in throughout the year. But as I said, a lot can happen in a year, and looking at the big picture and how those individual blog posts and pages all contribute to that goal is going to be really important. So there are things that you can ask yourself and some questions that you can have in mind when you're reviewing your site. Just like when you first started out creating the site, it's going to be very similar, but with a little bit of a, is this still working slant? So for instance, how has your intended or ideal audience changed? Does your content and your messaging still align with that? Are you guiding people to the right areas of the site and bringing them the most relevant information for what they're looking for? Perhaps at one time you were highlighting the different events that you were throwing, but you've decided to hold less and less events. And so now you're focusing more on content. And so now the blog is a lot more of an important resource for your people to be able to utilize and see that it exists. Do all of your pages have a place in your cohesive plan? And is it all working together, or are there things that don't quite fit anymore? And does it all fit into your brand? Is the messaging still the same? Is the design still aligned with how your brand has evolved over the year? And then it's also a really great time to see how the website is holding up. As you were going throughout the year, is there anything that you noticed that really bugged you about having to update certain things? Is there something that you started doing that is now not working because you're doing it a different way? Or is there a new thing that you're doing that isn't quite working anymore and you need a better process for it? Is it a pain to update the site? So all of these sort of bigger picture questions that you can look back and reflect on, and then sort of look ahead at what you're planning. And all of those things can be done sort of together at this sort of refresh time of year. And how you answer these questions is obviously then going to determine how you go about planning for the coming year when it comes to your site. Is it sort of make a few little updates in the first quarter and then sort of maintain from there and see what happens? Or are there bigger changes that you need to make that you need to put on the calendar to make sure that they get done? The new year is also a great time to check in on your hosting and your domain. This is an aspect of websites that sort of we can often take for granted, because a domain is a very low cost aspect of your website, and it's something that you would ideally have on auto charge every year, because that's the one thing that's so hard to get back if you lose it and somebody happens to snatch it up. So now's a good time to just double check. Take a second to log into the place where you've purchased your domain and make sure that it's still on auto renew, and make sure that that's locked down. And then while you're in there, either in the same place or if you have your hosting in a different location, it's also a good time to review your hosting. A lot changes with hosting companies over the year in terms of quality, in terms of how good the support is and all of that stuff. So if you haven't taken the time in the past year, if you haven't needed to contact support for any reason in the past year, number one, that's a great sign. That means it's working. But that also means that you haven't gotten a chance to see if the support is still any good. So it could be a good time to come up with a quick question, maybe something like, my website is slow. Do you have any recommendations? Or, just a little something to get into a conversation, or even just contact them and say, I'm curious about what other hosting options you have, right? Just because you don't dislike the host you're currently on doesn't mean that you maybe need a different plan with them, right? So it's a good time to check in with them and see, am I on the right plan for my current traffic levels? Especially if you anticipate any kind of traffic increase, that would be a good time to make sure that your host can handle that, and that the price isn't going to, double just because you get a few, 1,000 more hits on your website. So overall, you can ask the questions like, are you happy with your host? Have there been any problems, and how many? How fast were those problems resolved? How was support? Is it easy to do what you need to do? Can you run a backup tool right in your host? Or do you have to sort of go jump through hoops to try to get a backup of your site? And how easy is it to restore that backup? So those are just some of the questions that you can ask about your host. You can do a quick search to see what else is out there. There's a ton of hosts. So you're going to look into ones that have the type of features that you need in the right price range with the right amount of room for growth. So it's a little bit complex in terms of trying to figure out what the best hosting option is for you and your company, especially if you're not sure how to anticipate how big your site might get in the upcoming year. But as long as they have that room for growth, that room for adjustment, and they're doing a solid job of supporting your site, that's a great time to just sort of check in on all that and make sure that your host is still working for you and that it looks like it's going to work in the coming year. So an annual checkup is a great time to just double check that everything's working and that you can sort of feel secure in your choice. That's not to say nothing's going to happen at all, as things always happen. But if you've done the work to make sure that you feel secure in your host, then you can at least be sure that you'll have those backups, you'll have the support behind you to sort of take care of any issues that arise. And then as we're taking a look through our host and our goals, we can also review our content and implement any processes behind that. Reviewing and checking in is a great thing to do, but it doesn't have much impact if there isn't a concrete plan to follow through. Your specific tasks are obviously going to depend on your site and what you find when you're reviewing the strategy and the goals, but the general idea is going to stay the same. There's going to be processes ideally set up for things like making sure plugins stay up to date, making sure, your platform is up to date, making sure that, if you delete a page, it gets redirected. So all of those things ideally would have a process behind it. So if you do this thing, all of these other things sort of fall in place behind it. But most of the time when you interact with your website, it's going to involve adding or editing some portion of your content. So outdated information anywhere else on your site is a bit of a flag. So now's a good time to make sure that you have a list of all the places where dates and other yearly things need to change. So if you have holidays listed or days that you're closed, those might change from year to year. A lot of processes just thrive when you maintain them. So you have some types of information that at a minimum should be reviewed once a year, like those, but it's even better when you can make it part of your existing processes. So for instance, when your address changes, you have to update your bills, you notify your family. If your contact info is on your website, add that to the website update list. When you fill an open position that you've posted on your site, remove the job listing. So all of those things get added to that process. Same with staff. When someone joins the team, you onboard them. So you give them a login, they fill out paperwork, all that stuff. When they leave, you offboard them. You remove their accounts, you revoke building access, whatever you need to do to offboard them. If you have staff on your site, you're going to add updating the website to those lists. And how long has it been since the headshots were updated? People's faces change over time. So as you're reviewing the site, you're going to make note of all of the places where you go, oh, wow, they left months ago. Or, oh my goodness, this information just is really outdated. I should make sure that this is gone. So all of those places that you find that content as you're reviewing it, add it to your process list. And then also make note of how long it's been since you've published a blog post. If you had a blog at one time and you haven't posted in a long time, that's fine. Not all sites need a blog, but if you're going to have one, publishing a post at least a few times a year instills that confidence in you as a company. And if you're not going to keep it updated, you don't have to get rid of it, but consider removing it from a place of prominence and filling that space with something that's going to help your visitors get where they need to be. Remove it from the homepage. Get rid of the top level navigation and put a link to in the footer instead. Processes are also going to help make sure that any pages related to old marketing campaigns get removed. So when you finish a campaign, you make note of when you need to remove or unpublish the landing page. So sometimes they stick around because you've posted on social about it and you've added it to your bio, or it's something that someone might come across. So maybe that just stays there until, it's no longer relevant to your business, right? So maybe that page doesn't necessarily need to be added to any kind of process. But if you have like a marketing campaign where traffic is being sent to this page and then you take the ad down, maybe you redirect that page, or maybe you just make note that it's going to go to a page not found. You don't always need to redirect things, but you may need to remove the page. It could be something, again, that's not relevant anymore. And then when you remove those pages, then you're also going to remove links referencing those old pages. And so all of that content should be edited or removed. Everything that I've suggested can be done at any time during the year, aside from the copyright date. So you can set your annual review for any time during the year and just give yourself a task on, January 1st to update your copyright date if necessary. But it sure does feel great to know that you're starting the year off strong instead of with a website emergency. You're going to make sure that you're setting up time on the calendar for those quarterly, monthly, and weekly tasks. And then giving yourself this annual time to do a more high-level overall view. And keep an eye on things like accessibility, performance, security, automations, form submissions, WordPress and plugin updates. All of those things are going to need time throughout the year. And this higher level view of everything lends itself to making those things be more effective that you're doing. If there's anything you came across while reviewing your site that you want to revisit, that goes on the calendar too, as well as periodically checking in on that goal progress. Annual checks go beyond just updating the copyright date at the bottom of your website, but the more that you do to set yourself up for a good year, the easier it's going to be. And the more annual checks you do, the easier they're going to get over time and the less time it'll take each year.